Hello, my name is Alan Mayer. I'm a retired Anglican priest, assisting in the parish of St Mary Horsham. We've been in isolation now we're into our third week, and I was due to give 3 talks on the first days of Holy Week. I intend still to do them, but I'll have to do them online. These 3 talks at the beginning of Holy Week are entitled Anointed, Remembered, and Betrayed. And this is the first of the talks, the one about Jesus being anointed. It's based on a few verses from St Mark's Gospel, chapter 14. In St Mark's Gospel, the story of Christ's passion unfolds, and as it does so, this surprising thing happens. And this is my own translation of Mark chapter 14, verses 1 to 11. Now it was just 2 days before the Passover and the unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way artfully to arrest Jesus and kill him. For they said, not during the holiday, in case the people riot. And while he was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, whilst he was having a lie down, in came a woman with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment of pure nard. And having broken it open, she poured it on his head. And some were personally outraged and were saying, why has this ointment been wasted like this? Because it could possibly have been sold for more than 300 denarii, that's getting on for a year's wages for a labourer, and given to the poor. And they muttered about her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why are you making trouble for her? She has done a good piece of work for me, because you always have the poor with you, and you can do good to them whenever you like, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She came in advance to anoint my body for burial. Let me assure you that wherever this good news is going to be announced in the whole world, with it, what this woman has done will be spoken about as her memorial. And Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went off to the chief priests so that he might hand him over to them. And when they heard, they were pleased, and they promised to give him money. And he tried to find a convenient way to hand him over. So that's the story, and it's clear then Mark understands something of significance as he begins this final run-up to the crucial events of Holy Week. This is a kind of pre-echo of what is to come. The religious hierarchy and their bureaucrats, the senior clergy and the scribes, were casting around for ideas about how to shut Jesus up, preferably permanently, and with as little blame coming their way as possible. It has proved impossible for them to arrest him in broad daylight because the crowds like him, and there was always the possibility of a riot or some popular disturbance which would have brought severe punishment on the Jewish leaders from the Roman authorities. So it becomes increasingly clear to the Jewish religious bosses that Jesus will have to be arrested and kidnapped on the quiet at night. It is at this point that faithful Mark inserts the story about the woman with the expensive perfumed oil. This wasn't the usual cheap scent, rose petals in oil or water. This stuff was a specific make of expensive imported perfume from the Orient. It was made from a plant that only grew in India. Far off. You'd have to know who was importing it and pay through the nose for it. You couldn't get it down at the local market. In other Gospels, the story falls at different times and in different places in the narrative, but Mark, the earliest gospel writer, places it here, right in the Passion narrative, and he does so deliberately. Here he interrupts the drama of the plot against Jesus right in the middle of the conflict and the stirrings of betrayal, because it has an important message for his readers. It informs us, the readers, about the kind of person Jesus is. It shows us that the leading characters of the nation were determined to kill someone who is innocent. It makes us feel for him. During the 30 years or so between the events described here and Mark actually writing them down, the early church had used Isaiah a lot in their Bible studies. They will have read Isaiah chapter 42. They will have read these words and they will have recognized Jesus in them. Here is what they say, once again in my own paraphrase, Isaiah 42 verse 1. Look at my servant, the one I support. Look at my chosen one, in whom my heart delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or raise his voice, or make the people in the street hear him. He won't even break off a broken reed or pinch out a smouldering wick. Faithfully, he will bring justice. He will not fail or be disheartened until he has established integrity on the earth, and the islands will expect his law. Yahweh, God, created the heavens and stretched them out. He stretched out the earth and everything that comes out from it. He gives breath to its people and life to those who live on it. This is what Yahweh God says. I, Yahweh, have called you in integrity, and I will hold your hand, and I will keep you and make you a promise to the people, to be a light for the nations, to open blind eyes, to bring the captives out of the dungeon, to bring those who are sitting in the dark out of the prison. Now, when those early Christians read those words, they recognized somebody they knew. They recognized Jesus himself. Isaiah's vision was about justice being established through love and compassion. Mark is saying Isaiah's book had stopped just being poetic words and had been seen and known by them in flesh and blood. Notice that when Mark tells the story of the woman with the perfume jar, he doesn't tell us who she is. He just says, in came a woman. But she must have been at least recognised, if not expected, judging from the lack of reaction from the others present. But you can see from Jesus' reaction to her that her life must have been deeply touched by Jesus in some way. And how did she get in? She obviously wasn't one of the guests. Well, often in those days, if you were throwing a dinner party or you had got some important guests coming to socialise, you would make sure the neighbours all knew about it. You might all sit out in the courtyard or open up all your doors and windows so that the neighbours could come and gawp. So it wouldn't have been difficult for her just to walk straight up to the house and come in. It wasn't an act of vandalism for her to break open the flask. It had been bought straight from the importer and was an unopened flask. It will have been sealed with cork and possibly tar to keep it as airtight as a modern flask for its long journey. And to get at the contents, you would naturally break the neck of the flask. At home, you would have decanted it into another container with a replaceable stopper. But this was an act of worship and a sacrifice. She gave it all to Jesus in one go. As she did so, people began muttering about her. Well, they would, wouldn't they? Even to our jaded sense of what is proper, this would be regarded as rude, as a bit too personal for comfort. But it wasn't the potentially erotic content of the gesture that made them mutter. There was no nudge, nudge, wink, wink in their comments. It was all about how improper it was to waste something that expensive. This is not nudge, nudge, wink, wink, but proper, righteous indignation, of the kind you might expect from a Victorian patriarch. What a shameful, wicked waste, they said. That's a year's wages for some poor blighter, gone right down the drain. Think how many poor people might have been helped if it had been sold unopened. Mark gives the impression that their muttering continued. And we can only assume that she could hear every word in those intimate surroundings. They intended to hurt her and embarrass her, but they had missed the point, as many self-righteous people do all the time. It's not the outward appearance of what's going on that's important. The meaning of an event might well be concealed from those who go only by outward appearances, which is, of course, why Jesus reacts in the way he does. I translated Jesus' words like this: "Leave her alone. Why are you making trouble for her? She has done a good piece of work for me." But perhaps, a bit surprisingly, but no less truly, he then reminds them, you always have the poor with you, and you can do good to them whenever you like, but you will not always have me. The crucial thing, he says, gives them the answer to their criticism of her. He opens their eyes to see the deep meaning of this event, which lies beneath the outward appearances of it. She did what she could. She came in advance to anoint my body for burial. Here Jesus is inviting those sitting, reclining at the table, to look beyond the outward appearances to a deeper reality. Jesus is often seen doing this in his parables and in his healing ministry. Here is what I would like you to take away from this talk. This anonymous woman had come to worship Jesus in her own wordless way. Within herself, she knew something true about Jesus. She knew somehow who he was. She knew that there was an impending tragedy and that he wouldn't survive the coming crisis. Therefore, she did what she could and worshipped him with this costly gift. One thing she was sure of: those sitting around that table had no idea who Jesus really was. They didn't appreciate, as she did, the love and forgiveness of God that were filling him up and pouring out of him. She knew that and worshipped it in a way that these meticulous law servers couldn't. They were incapable of even shaking someone's hand without thinking about the ritual and theological implications of what they were doing. They were a million miles from patting him on the back or giving him a hug. She showed them how to be natural and human towards the mighty God who had taken flesh and become one of us. That's the story. She worshipped him like a human. She expressed the devotion she felt in a very physical act of worship. It was a perfect union of the outward and visible action and the inner feeling of love and devotion. It was a sacrament. It was an offering from her to him of herself, complete, mind, body, and spirit. The sacrifices in the temple didn't even come close. But here in the house of Simon, his guests saw it and remembered. Later on, as the church remembered her and the thing she had done, they thought on a bit further. They saw in these events a revelation of worship from the woman, and forgiveness from him for her imperfections. Other Gospels say she was a woman with a bit of a reputation in the town, and you can see why they might have made that assumption. It's a mistake to think of her as Mary Magdalene giving up prostitution to become a follower of Jesus. That just doesn't appear anywhere in the Gospels. Whoever she was, she revealed Jesus as the Anointed One, the Messiah, the Christ, though not at all the Messiah that most people expected. They wanted a warlord. What they got was the Prince of Peace. In the Gospel of John, this story is repeated and the woman is identified. She is not Mary Magdalene, but another Mary, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, the lady who sat at Jesus' feet and listened to him as he taught. His words had touched her deeply. She had raised her brother from the tomb. She knew him very well indeed. And that's why she did this service for him. She worshipped him with all she had. Mark finishes the story with the starkest of all contrasts. In the next verse, after this act of love, Mark shows us an act of cowardice and betrayal as Judas Iscariot creeps away and for a price plots his evil deed. She had spent her own money to worship the Anointed One. Judas was to receive money from others for his act of betrayal. So finally Jesus says to the people at the dinner, "You will not always have me." You can see the truth. The crucial thing for us Christians is not whether we are morally perfect. It's not that we make correct judgments all the time, or whether we always spend or get our money the best way, or whether our actions always leave the world a better place. We know we are imperfect. That's why we start our church services more often than not with an acknowledgement of our imperfection, a cry, "Lord, have mercy." When Jesus says, "You will not always have me," he is saying that it's not about being perfect. It's actually about how we are with other people, and specifically how we are with him. The woman's over-the-top demonstration of her devotion shows how close she is to him in his perfection. He, meanwhile, is showing us the overwhelming generosity of God towards us, the imperfect, the undeserving. She did what was in her power to respond to what he had already done for her, loving her, and if she needed it, forgiving her, healing her. We, along with the guests at that dinner, need to take away from this scene the same lesson. There's not one of us who hasn't given a lavish or generous present to someone we love, because in doing that we are acknowledging what they have done for us. When we do that, we are doing what is in our power to respond to what they have done for us and what they mean for us. Reflect tonight on how you respond to God, to his healing, his generosity, and his quite undeserved love. Amen.